Well, welcome to this week's edition of Thursdays with Mike. And I'm actually sitting on the threshold of Abraham Bryan's house here on Cemetery Ridge. Brianna, go ahead and say hello.
Hello.
Geez, I have a camera woman today. So, Brianna, let's just take a look at the house. Abraham Bryan was a free black man who owned this house. They fled as the Confederates came. It's just part of the history I wasn't familiar with growing up. They just swooped up anyone who was black. Period. They didn't ask questions. Were you a free man? Were you a freed slave? Were you an escaped slave? They just treated them all the same. So. They skedaddled from here, and we're looking out this way. This is actually looking over the landscape of Pickett's Charge, which was made across these fields from Seminary Ridge there in the distance. And now, the key thing for me historically, my mom was raised, she's actually born in South Carolina and raised in North Carolina several generations. And growing up in the 60s, she frequently told stories of her great-great uncle, might have just been her great uncle, it'd be my great-great uncle, who was in the 26th North Carolina, Pettigrew's Brigade, Heath's Division, A.P. Hill's Corps in the Army of Northern Virginia, and that he lost a leg in Pickett's Charge. And Pettigrew's brigade, Pickett was over a little bit further here. Pettigrew's brigade was actually coming up right here, and this was the apex of their advance right here. This was as far as they got. Union lines were here, and this is where they stopped. The number of them clustered around this free black man's farm. And that was kind of their last stand before they either were killed, captured, or retreated back down that way. Now I have my Gettysburg Bible, which is actually the book by Alan Guelzo, Gettysburg. I've read this numerous times, read it before this trip, and just two readings, if you'll permit me. Two readings, both having to do with Pickett's Charge on July 3rd, 1863. Just right beyond us here is what was called the Angle, and that's where Pickett's division came into its final moments, its climax at the Angle. And this is how Guelzo describes that moment. Lewis Armistead, who was one of Pickett's brigade commanders, he was not interested in bogging down into a slugging match around the trees, the clump of trees, which are right behind there. Directly ahead, he saw the ruined guns of Cushing's battery. Behind them, Alexander Webb's last reserve regiment of the Philadelphia Brigade of the 72nd Pennsylvania. And beyond them, nothing. Nothing but the Provost Guard and the dead horses and overturned wagons in the Taneytown Road. Nothing but daylight and victory and the destruction of the Army of the Potomac and the end of the war and independence and peace. And so he lowered his sword and called, "The day is ours, men. Come turn this artillery on them." And for a moment, the balances shivered and teetered, unsure which future world to bless. I just love that line. For a moment, everything teetered, but eventually they were stopped there and then pushed back. Now I just want to come on ahead and just a few yards, 100 yards this way, up to the Abraham Bryan house. And as Guelzo describes what happened on that location, let me just get on over here. As Pettigrew's brigade was stopped here, Webb and Hayes, Union commanders here who stopped them, and seeing the Confederates fleeing, others captured, it seems to have occurred, Guelzo says, to neither Webb nor Hayes nor anyone else at that moment how ironic it was that the Army of Northern Virginia's last hope for a victorious breakthrough expired in bleeding flight from the property of Abraham Bryan, a free black man, a species of humanity which was, by most Confederate understandings, not even supposed to exist. Lee and his men had given what Porter Alexander called the best we had in the shop. Porter Alexander was his artillery chief. Right down to the handsome young lieutenants moving bravely and impossibly to the attack, singing Dixie under waving swords and snapping flags, and they had, in the end, not been able to roll the stone to the top of the mountain after all. There was already, in a faint sense, in the minds of these Confederate soldiers on Cemetery Ridge, standing there as the sun and the hopes of the Confederacy together sank toward South Mountain, that something unutterably vital had just happened, something to be engraved in bronze books and on pedestals of gray granite, something that would make every man who had been there and survived raise a toast, like Harry the King's happy few on every anniversary of the battle, something which would make this place a name everyone would recognize without explanation. But the greatest achievement of the great battle would turn out to be its humblest as well. For Abraham Bryan would return to his 12 acres and his whitewashed cottage and barn, and he and his family would live there until he sold the property in 1869, and no one would make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it. I love that. So I just couldn't think of a more appropriate place on which to do this edition of Thursdays with Mike. Knowing my family connection here, and that, yeah, my family connection was stopped here, thankfully. And I sit on the threshold of a legacy left behind, which is freedom. And two worlds teetered. Which way would it go? And I guess that's always the case for all of us, isn't it? Worlds teetering. Which way will it go? What decisions will we make? So thank you for sharing a few moments with me. And we'll see you next week in our next Thursdays with Mike.